Well, my gratitude for you just went way up. That's the first time I had a chance to hear you. Wow. Hopefully it won't be the last. So, give thanks. This is our week of Thanksgiving. This is our time that the month Reverend Marty has been walking us through gratitude and how important that is in the spiritual walk that we're taking, right? And especially with this being Thanksgiving week, I am so grateful for, as I stated at the top of the service, that just to be here, just to be in a place that's so beautiful, so wonderful. Even the rain, it's beautiful here. It's just wonderful. See, when you live in the desert, that's the comparison. That's the comparison, right? And that's why in life we have our highs and our lows, right? Because if you didn't have the lows, you couldn't appreciate the highs as much as you do. And so I'm even grateful for rain. People around me, where I live, they're like, oh, the rain. I hear the weather person saying, oh, we got more nasty rain. Rain is good. Rain is good. When you don't see a drop of it for 9 months at a time, it's good. And this is a time, I think, where a lot of us start to get reflective about the past year and how, because the year is coming to a close now. And when I put together this talk, it really spoke to me, and it's still like evolving in my head. So I don't know what Spirit's going to have coming out of my mouth today, but that there is this unwritten rule that whenever ministers give talks, we're really just talking to ourselves. You're just along for the ride. We're just giving ourselves the lessons that we need to hear again and again and again. And so giving thanks for our inner wisdom is the topic that I have today, but I'm going to an unusual place for that inner wisdom. I think that life is speaking to us all the time. Would you agree? There's so much feedback coming to us at all times from every place imaginable. And it's our job to pay attention to this feedback. It's our job to keep listening and going, oh, maybe that was a message for me. Not just in a Sunday service, but even throughout our week. Spirit and life are always talking to us and giving us feedback. So I was watching a documentary on the group, the Eagles. Anybody like the Eagles like I do? Oh, so many wonderful songs they have. And this documentary was called The History of the Eagles. It was a pretty comprehensive documentary about how they all started and how they came together and the metamorphosis over the years of what they did together. But one of the things that stood out to me was Joe Walsh, who came into the band later on. But he was talking about how he was in the Eagles. They happened to be in Chicago for a gig. And they were real excited about being there. Chicago's a great place, all these wonderful, fine restaurants and things to do. And he said, there was a knock on my hotel door. And in walked John Belushi. And John goes, come on, I'm going to take you to one of the best restaurants in Chicago. So they go to this really nice restaurant. And because they were both wearing jeans, they could not get in. The maitre d' said, I'm sorry, we have a dress code here. You cannot get in. So Joe Walsh said, okay, we'll find another place to eat. And John Belushi's like, oh no, we're going into that restaurant. He goes, you just wait right here. He disappears for a few minutes, comes back. They step into the alley next to the restaurant. And John produces a spray paint can from the paper bag that he brought, black spray paint. And they spray painted each other's jeans black because the pants had to be black. So they walk into the restaurant, and now, okay, you have black pants. Okay, here, just have a seat right over here, gentlemen. They sit down on needle-pointed Queen Anne chairs. Had a very fine meal as they're sitting there. And as they got up to leave, they realized, oh, there's some black there on that needle point. So Joe Walsh said, we ended up backing out the door because it had kind of worn off and it was like not black on their behinds. So he said, you can spray paint your clothes, but you're always still the same you. And isn't that a wonderful lesson that we all can understand? That we can change, and a lot of us go through all kinds of machinations to change that which we are. We can lose weight, we can get a new hairstyle, we can do all kinds of things. And yet, if you're not changing that inner, you are still you. That old saying, wherever you go, there you are. Have you ever left a job because there was a really awful boss that you worked for? So you find a new job, and guess what? There's that same old new boss and a whole new body. If we don't heal, and we don't grow, and we don't do our inner work, we get to keep repeating the same things over and over. I know people who have married the same person in different bodies several times. Can I get an amen to that? Yes. And so we have to take a look. What is life constantly telling us when we are in the midst of our everyday lives? So it turns out that while I'm watching this documentary, there are several lessons about consciousness. Leave it to the eagles to be teaching us about consciousness. So I'm going to focus on 3 of those lessons today. And the first lesson is, know when it's time to move on. There's an old picture of them. Don Henley with lots of hair. I'm still not over Glenn Frey not being with us anymore. I was so shocked when he made his transition. But know when it's time to move on. You see, that great I am within you is always pushing you forward. Ernest Holmes, the founder of religious science, said, there's a divine urge within each one of us to keep moving forward and upward, right? And that if we deny this, that's what can lead to depression and just feeling out of sorts because you're not living up to what you really want to be doing and could be doing in your life. So there was something within Don Henley and Glenn Frey when they were teenagers that said they had to be musicians. They picked up their guitars and they were just like, we got to be musicians. Now, Glenn Frey grew up in Michigan. Don Henley grew up in Texas. But they both knew that their passions were calling them to something greater than that within their hometown experience. So they performed in local bands and cut their teeth on how to be a musician, but then they knew it was time to move to Los Angeles. At that time in the 70s, that's where everything was happening in rock and roll music. So they both moved there, and they ended up playing with each other. How they met was they were each individually asked to be the backup band for Linda Ronstadt. Remember her? So here they are. They finally have this steady gig. They're making good money. And they're playing with someone who's a fantastic vocalist, who appreciates them and values them. And yet their divine urge was going, there's something more. There's something more. Now, a lot of people might have stopped here and said, this is good. This is great, as a matter of fact. Musicians would kill to get something like this. And yet, Glenn and Don both knew that they needed to go out on their own and keep moving on. So they approached Linda and said, look, there's something bigger that we've got to do. We so appreciate working with you and all that you have allowed us to learn and to grow. And yet there's something more. She was so gracious because she knew it was not her job to hold them there. It's not our job to hold anyone anywhere. We're here to encourage people. There's a reason why courage is in the word encourage. Because sometimes it takes our own courage to say, you do what you have to do. That's very hard sometimes, isn't it? Especially if you see maybe a child or someone that you really love and care about going in a direction maybe you wish they wouldn't. And yet, who knows that that wouldn't be the perfect experience to teach them what they need to learn. I know my parents probably shuddered when I told them some of the things that, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And yet they had the courage to say, you can do anything you want. There was probably a few sleepless nights, and yet the mistakes that I made me who I am. Can you agree? Did that happen in your life? The mistakes that we make, we're actually, they're not mistakes at all. It's simply feedback for what not to do again, right? So know when it's time to move on, because the Eagles would not have happened if Glenn and Don had not had the courage to step into something greater than what they were currently experiencing, no matter how great it was. One of my teachers said this wonderful phrase, and I've never forgotten it. He said, don't ever let your good get in the way of your better. Don't ever let your good get in the way of your better. And I have thought of that many, many times when things were good, but I knew something better was out there. We have to listen. So the second lesson that I learned from the Eagles was write your own music, meaning create your own life. I saw a bumper sticker one day, and I loved it so much. It said, learn from others, but go to your own school. Learn from others, but go to your own school. And that's what this lesson is all about. Write your own music. Now, as I mentioned, Glenn Frey grew up in Michigan. He actually grew up in Detroit. And he happened to meet Bob Seger, who's also a very famous musician from Michigan. And Bob Seger was doing very, very well at the time. And here, young Glenn Frey was just up and coming. But Bob Seger liked Glenn. And he kind of took him under his wing. And he said, you know, this is what you've really got to do if you want to make it in rock and roll, in music. And he said, one of the things you have to do is write your own songs. And Glenn Frey said to him, well, what if they're bad songs? And Bob Seger said, they will be bad songs to begin with. But that's the point. When you write your own songs and you take the time to create, eventually you move into a place where you're getting better and better. That's the whole process of learning and growing. And so Glenn Frey thought, okay, I guess I need to write my songs. And you know what? I hear this from a lot of people. They know what's in their heart, but they don't. They basically say to me, but what if I can't do it? And this is where I say, this is where you got to do it. This is your time to step out. And because we don't believe there's any such thing as failure, right? It's simply the feedback of what we don't do again. This is where we get to have the courage to live by walking in faith. You know that phrase, right? We get to walk by faith. That means we can't see the outcome sometimes. But we get to live in that giant question mark called life, because there are no guarantees anyway. Even if you saw it, that's no guarantee. But we get to walk by faith and say, I don't know quite what's out there yet, but I'm being called to go to something greater than where I'm at right now. That's the whole point here. When we get to really have the courage to step into that great unknown and say, I don't know what's going to support me, yet I know that I'm going to leave my nets and cast my bread upon the water. This is walking by faith. So Glenn Frey, after he'd had this wonderful conversation with Bob, he started writing his songs, but this is right around the time he was being called to go to Los Angeles. So he moves there, and he's still kind of unclear. He's like, well, how do I write my own music? Do I just sit? Do I have to get a writing partner? Do I wait for inspiration to come to me, or do I just set aside time? He still was not clear. So he and Don Henley met up, and they found an apartment, a very affordable apartment, in a suburb of Los Angeles, And it just so happens, I love how life gives us these coinky-dinks, as my mother called them. What a coinky-dink. Just so happens that underneath them in their apartment lives, Bob Seger, lives Jackson Browne. Jackson Browne, who at that time was writing Doctor My Eyes. That was his big hit. So Glenn Frey and Don are living in the upstairs apartment. Jackson Browne's living in the basement apartment. And so because they're musicians and they're playing at night, they usually sleep in. But he said every morning at 9 a.m., we would be awakened through the floor by the whistle of a coffee kettle, of a tea kettle. And the whistle would go off, and we could hear Jackson downstairs, and he's making himself some tea. And then a few minutes later, we hear him walk over to his piano. He starts plunking out some notes. He goes through the first verse. He goes through it again. He goes through it again. He goes through it again. Then he gets to the chorus. He goes through it again. He goes through it again. So he said, after he's going through it, all this, then we hear the whistle of the tea kettle again. And he walks over, gets some tea, and then he sits down at the piano again. He said he would go through it 20, 30, 40 times. And Glenn said, that's when the inspiration hit me. He said, I realized that's how you do it. That's how you write. And he said, it's elbow grease, time, thought, persistence. So, is that not the great equation of life? Elbow grease, time, thought, persistence. That's the key to life, my friends. That is it. And yet, in this instant society, we all get really frustrated when we're not getting it right away, right? Well, it didn't work. Well, maybe some persistence might help us. So he listened to Jackson Browne again and again and again until Jackson got it just right. And from this great lesson came an incredibly beautiful #1 song. And Don Henley agreed with Glenn that that's it. That's how you do it. Elbow grease, time, thought, and persistence. You see, there is no substitute for this. You got to do the work. You got to put the time in. Building your consciousness, I hate to break it to you, is a full-time job. It is. And yet we think we can do this part-time thing and then have the results that we want in our life, but yet it is a full-time job, a full-time occupation. The only thing, I think I'm an okay minister. The only thing I have going for me in ministry is that I've got a really good work ethic. I show up. I dress up. I'm here. I'm willing to put in the time. And it's that, I think, that provides us the springboard, the opportunities. Wasn't it Henry Ford that said, opportunity shows up in overalls, and most of us miss it because of that? Because it's hard work. It's the willingness to do the work. I was talking with a few ministerial students at a conference recently, at a minister's conference, and these students had just graduated. And they came up to me after I had done a presentation, and they asked me questions along the lines of, what do I need to do to succeed in ministry? And my answer, elbow grease, time, thought, persistence. That's the secret formula for anything, not just ministry, for life. And I found that to be such a wonderful example of a great Bible in the story that I've always loved. It's in Nehemiah 6:3. And Nehemiah, as the story goes in the Bible, came into Jerusalem. And he saw that the city walls were falling down. So he went to the king and he said, look, I'd really like to shore up the walls here and make sure that the city is fortified. And can I rebuild the walls? And the king said yes. And he made him the governor of the province. And that came with great power. And yet, because he had that power, he became very unpopular. So people could not come and go as like they wanted to. They didn't have to worry about going through a single gate. They could kind of climb the wall or walk around, and they didn't like that. And here Nehemiah is just trying to build a good wall and to protect the city. So Nehemiah got some enemies. And these enemies decided they didn't want Nehemiah around anymore. So they decided to trick him. They sent a messenger to him there as he's building the wall. I just realized building the wall. Oh, yeah. But he's building the wall, not to keep people out, but to protect that which he has. So the enemy sent a messenger with a letter asking him to join him out in the desert. He says, you're needed out there. You need to come out. Nehemiah is up on the wall working on it. And this is what he says to the messenger. I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Tell so-and-so that I cannot come out to the desert. I am here doing my work, and I cannot come down. Now, if you go to the Fillmore's Metaphysical Bible, you see that Nehemiah represents one who is carried away from spiritual peace, which is symbolized by Jerusalem, into the confusion of sense, which is Babylon. And the rebuilding of the walls, see, everything in the Bible is simply a story, an allegory that we can use, and the people, the walls, represent the reconstruction of our soul consciousness. So here Nehemiah is rebuilding the soul consciousness, and the people represent thoughts, because the thoughts can't come and go as they please anymore. There has to be order. There's got to be thought. Is that really something that I should be thinking? Is that a thought or belief that supports me at this time in my life? And so this is a fabulous representation that that Nehemiah is showing us, that we can rebuild our consciousness when we tap into that inner wisdom that's always there. That inner wisdom that is always giving us that right thing. Have you ever had that, well, I got a gut feeling about this? That's your inner wisdom. It might be, maybe a thought comes to you completely, seemingly randomly. Oh, what a coinky-dink. And yet, this is simply your divine wisdom speaking to you. And when our thoughts, people, try to distract us from rebuilding, it's our job to say, I am doing a great work. I cannot come down. Have you ever had anybody tell you, you're going to do what? What do you mean? That doesn't make any sense. Get real. That's when you say, I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. You and I have such untapped genius and potential within us if we simply open up to it. If we simply open up. The third and final lesson that I learned from the eagles was this. Your soul's journey will take many detours. Now, I vividly remember the night I graduated from high school. I'm 18 years old. I can think back that far. And I remember thinking, wow, I got the world by the tail. I'm going to do this, and by 22, I'm going to have this, and by 30, I'm going to have this. It's laughable now. All the plans I had, Spirit was simply laughing her butt off, going, okay, you just go for it. I had no clue that all the detours that were going to come into my life. Has anyone besides me had a few detours? Just a few. Just a few. You think from point A to point B, and Spirit has a whole other plan for you. And yet, those plans turned out to be the best when we simply allow them to be. I don't know a single person who has ended up where they thought they'd be. Everybody has been in Plan B, Plan C, or even Plan Z. I know that has certainly taken place in my life. In the late 70s, Don Henley, this is number of the late 70s, Don Henley said, "This music thing is not a lifetime career that you can do forever." And he was referring to bands like the Beatles who had broken up. And most bands do break up eventually, because their band did break up in 1980. And whenever they were asked, will the Eagles ever get back together again? The answer was, when hell freezes over. So what was their new album in 1994 when they got back together? Hell Freezes Over. They got back together after being way apart for all these years, and there were some changes in the lineup. But in 2012, Don Henley said this: "We never, in our wildest dreams, figured on being this successful and lasting this long." They figured they'd be on to other things and do whatever musicians do once they've had their fun. And yet, Joe Walsh had this to say: "As you live your life, it appears to be anarchy and non-related events. And later, when you look back at it, it looks like a finely crafted novel." And a lot of the Eagle story is like that. Can you relate to that? I look back and I see, oh, that's why I went through that. That's what that experience was for. And as soon as I let go of these preconceived notions, it's got to be this, that's the only way I'm going to be happy, guess what? Life hands you so many other wonderful things if we're simply open to it. And here is a spiritual paradox. In order for you to not only survive, but to thrive, you need to surrender your control. Any other recovering general managers of the universe besides me in here? Not only could I tell you what was best for my life, I could tell you what was best for your life. I knew everything. And what I have found is when we simply let go and surrender, that everything, and I do mean everything in our life, is happening for a reason, a purpose, and is perfect. That the only life is Spirit's life living through me. And I get to celebrate that in all of its glory, in all of its shadows and light and dark. I get to celebrate all of that. So these are not detours of consciousness. They are detours of condition, and there's a difference. My consciousness can always stay firmly tuned into my divine wisdom and allow the conditions to change around me. We've all had conditions change in our life, sometimes quite severely sometimes, and yet our consciousness is still tuned into that divine. So while we're on these detours, our passion, our consciousness never wavers. Our conviction doesn't falter. We are staying true to that great I am within us. And we know that we are doing a great work and we cannot come down. So join me as we close this in prayer. Father, Mother God, we're so grateful. Grateful for this week especially, for all that we have in our lives, all that is good, all that is seemingly not good. We bless it all. We bless everything that has happened to us in our previous life condition. We know that we are always lifted up and supported by Spirit, even when we are walking by faith, not even knowing what is next. We just simply surrender and say, thank you, Spirit, for all the good that we have in our lives. There is always something for which we can be grateful. And so today we especially say thank you. Thank you, Spirit, for all that is, all that has been, and all that will be. We are eternally grateful. I give a special blessing today for all of those who are serving our country, both in the continental United States and all the far-flung places in the world where they may be. I give them great thanks for serving, for unconditionally saying, I am here to serve a greater cause. They too are doing a mighty work, and they cannot come down. And so I simply give our blessing today upon this service, upon our town, upon our community, upon our state, upon our country, upon our world, that we are blessed to be living in this wonderful time, this wonderful life, that we have so much to be grateful for. For this and so much more, I just say, thank you, Spirit. Thank you, Spirit. I let it be so. And together we say, and so it is. Amen.